Hello. Hi, this is Brad Beira here. It is just before 10 o'clock, but we've switched on the broadcast so that those of you that have logged in early know that we're about to start. We're going to wait 2 or 3 more minutes until everyone is registered, and then we'll kick off. Those of you that are on will be able to see that there's a questions tab where you can put a question in. So we're going to hold off for 2 minutes. It's a little before 10 o'clock, and then we'll start at 10 and move on from there. So welcome to everyone. This is it's an overwhelming and difficult conversation to have because there's so much information in so many ways, in so many aspects. And one of the things about this is as much as we know that we know almost nothing. So I come in here as a interested person, as a scholar, the person who's weathered through the economic impacts of a series of pandemics and epidemics and health shocks across the world over the last 20 years. So we're going to go through a series of slides. There was a chap back in the mid-2000s who wrote a book called A Good Hard Kick in the Arse on Venture Capital. His name was Rob Adams, and he said, if you can't say it in 9 slides, you shouldn't say it. I think in this case, I confess that I can't say it in 9 slides. So we've narrowed it down to around 40 slides. A lot of them are graphic with representation, and we're going to go through them starting now. Please, if you've got questions, you can type them through and I'll answer them. They'll come up on the screen here. So we're going to start off, and all things being equal, I'm going to move through the agenda. So the agenda is going to cover, not necessarily in this order, it's going to cover the update on the pandemic, where we are from a global and a South African context. We're going to reflect on the economic and social impacts of the pandemic because the two of them sit side by side. Many of you will know Adam Smith as an economist back in the 1700s for the book that he published called The Wealth of Nations. But before that, he published a book called The Theory of Human Sentiment, where he said that the more we emotionally attach to any object or person, the greater utility we have. The greater utility have, the more we'll want to trade and transact with it. And so the social impact of this pandemic are possibly as important as any other considerations. We're going to touch on corporate governance considerations. We're going to touch on risk-bearing capacity and what it means in terms of calculating economic and financial impacts. And we're going to talk about a business continuity and risk management methodology. I say all of that, and that's a big ask for a short period of time. But this is intended to be a touch-based and conversation. After this, over the period of the next few weeks, we'll go into more detail on each of these topics. So as we kick off now, let's just start with very briefly an overview of COVID-19. We know that it is a novel virus. What that means is it's new to us, and it's new to us because it is a virus that hasn't been seen in humans or transmitted between humans and humans before. Its vector comes from a source that is non-human, either bird or mammal. And we know that this is the third of such viruses, the first one being the sudden acute respiratory virus called SARS, the second one being MERS. Well, the first one was in 2003, the second one in 2012. They began as epidemics, meaning they were central to a specific location. Because of the spread and how quickly the spread has gone globally, it's now a pandemic. And then the third piece to consider is once it stays in the population and circulates, it then becomes endemic to the population. So the influenza virus has been epidemic. It has also been pandemic, as you'll see on the next slide. It's now endemic, meaning that it's always around and we spread it on a regular basis. In this case with COVID, predominantly it causes, in its most severe form, respiratory and digestive symptoms, a very aggressive pneumonia in its most severe form that leads to organ failure and death. But it also, in the majority of cases, causes the mild symptoms, fevers, cough, breathlessness, muscle pain, fatigue. So we know that the majority of people are not going to get significantly or profoundly ill. We just don't know how many people will get significantly and profoundly ill. And as we're learning, we're going. This is spread by droplet transmission. And the vectors for droplet transmission, coughing, sneezing, and touching of surfaces. You've heard and read and been exposed to a lot of discussion around the droplet transmission. I'm going to drop down to the bottom of that slide because the primary strategy for the prevention of spread is personal hygiene and social distancing. The triangles of your hands, the surface, and your face being the one triangle, and the second triangle being yourself and another person, and the droplet transmission between the two of you are the two big areas of infection prevention and control that's been initially supported by the WHO and has now been adopted by our country's prevention strategies. We also know that the time from infection to the earliest symptoms is roughly 3 to 5 days. After that, the progression to severe symptoms is another 3 to 5 days. So what you're looking at is a window period between when you breathe in the virus and you become infected with the symptoms of the virus of roughly 5 days, and another roughly 5 days until it gets really severe. The thing about this virus that makes it so infectious is that you can spread this as a person who doesn't have infection. So you can have infection, but you may not have symptoms. So you can feel fine, you can have no fever, no muscle pain, no cough, no shortness of breath, and you can still spread the virus through your transaction and your relationship with other people. So that's a key point that made this different from SARS. The sudden acute respiratory syndrome virus was highly contagious when people were already ill. And what that did is it meant that those people who were already ill, and Ebola is a very good similar example, is caregivers and families and health support workers were the people who got most ill. In this case, because you can feel fine and still be able to spread the virus is spreading in communities very fast. So I thought I'd give you an example of what that looks like as we move forward. So as a history, this is not our first respiratory pandemic in the last 100 years. There's been a lot of talk about Spanish flu, and we're going to talk about Spanish flu in terms of how the supply chain enabled the flu of 1918 and 1919 to progress very quickly out of the trenches of the European area of the Second World War back into cities. So it was guesstimated at that time that roughly 40 to 50 million people died. From there was a flu which was then named the Russian flu, and about 1 million people died from that, and that was later on in the century. Then you had Asian flu, and roughly 1.5 million people died from that. Then you had Hong Kong flu, then about 1 million people died from that. So we've had respiratory illnesses that have gone through the last 100 years, and adjacent to that, you've also got measles epidemics, you've got yellow fever epidemics, and you've got HIV/AIDS, a virus where between 25 and 35 million people have died. where we also don't have a definitive vaccine and definitive cure. We've got supportive medicines for it, but we haven't found, as we would have hoped for, the kind of support that we need in order to eradicate the virus. So if you look at that slide, you can see 56 million people died of smallpox over the period, 40 to 50 million people of Spanish flu, 30 odd million on HIV/AIDS. So this is not new for us. What is new for us is this is the first time in the history of a pandemic that we can actually follow through and manage. I've got a note from Alan who says he can't hear anything. I've got other people saying they can hear, Alan, so just send me a note if you still can't hear. So moving forward, while we wait for a feedback from Alan, I wanted to show you this graph because a lot of questions is, well, how novel is this virus? So I've left the link up there for those of you who have an interest in the family of the virus. And so basically what they've been doing is every time we test for the virus, we look a little further. And as of 2 days ago, the number was 2,499 genomes that we sampled. It's now closer to 2,700, of which there are 339 at this stage, different mutations of the virus that have been identified. So really what this picture shows is that as this moves from country to country, the relationship with the viruses is changing and the nature of the virus is modifying. That has big effects on how we build vaccines, how we look at spread, and how we look at the sensitivity of the virus. So this is the World Health Organization situation dashboard. It came out for the first time yesterday. And what's fairly pervasive about this is you can see how many countries, how many continents the spread is now sitting on. You've got 205 countries, areas, or territories. As of this date, which was yesterday at 6 o'clock in the evening, you had 40,777 deaths. And if you look at the bottom left-hand side, you'll see the relatively low growth for February and March, and then the very aggressive growth over the last month as the numbers have increased. So I'm using this as reference, and then I'm going to use the next slide to show you that between yesterday and today, you'll see that the numbers in terms of the Johns Hopkins reflection that you can see on the screen shows us that there's just short of 1 million confirmed cases, 937,567 as of this morning, and this was at 6:45 this morning. You can see the US's number is 216,000, Italy's is now 110,000, Spain is 104,000. But I've also flagged at the bottom on the right-hand side, you can see that this date a month ago, the total worldwide number was 90,000. So we've gone from 18,000 on the 2nd of February to 90,000 on the 2nd of March to 937,000 on the 2nd of April. There has been a significant number of persons who have tested positive for this virus. There's 47,500 persons globally who died. Italy has a mortality rate, sadly, of 13,155, 9,387 in Spain. This becomes important not only for the social and human loss that attaches to it, but it also gives us insights into what the economic and social burdens and the pressures are that go with this, and we're going to talk about that in a little while. So moving forward from here, this is a dashboard that has recently become available here, and I'll share these links with you. But here we're looking at South Africa specifically. If you look on the left-hand side, you can see confirmed infections on the last 15 days. Now, what's dramatic about this for us is from the 27th, where we were seeing a fairly rapid triple-digit growth, we're now looking at low double digits, 17 new infections on the 28th, 27 on the 31st, 27 yesterday. Now, it's too soon to know whether this relates to the lockdown and the extreme positive actions that we've taken to try and limit the spread of the virus, or if this is simply reflecting our testing numbers. But what this does suggest for us is up until the 28th, we were following a trajectory not dissimilar to Italy, the US, and China. Now we're following a trajectory that's closer to South Korea that seems to have significantly reduced the impact and the what we talk about in flattening the curve. We flatten the speed of the infection rate across the country. Now, whether this is going to be persistent or not is too soon to tell, but it would be fantastic for us as a community if this was indeed the rate and the risk was low. I say that because cautiously I'm optimistic, but when I look at the rest of the countries and I look at the spread and I look at the behaviors that are going on in some of the videos that were shared yesterday, I don't think that we are behaving in a manner collectively and individually that is going to protect us in terms of social and communal spread. So I'm trying to see, I saw a question come through. The question is, there is talk that the China number has been heavily understated. So the reality is we just don't know. If you look at the numbers that came out of China in the first quarter, it was very low, and then we had a very big increase of 10,500 on a day, and then it dropped down again significantly after that. The truth is, we don't know. We don't know what the numbers look like in any of the countries. I don't think that when we look at the numbers now of the US and Western Europe, I think this is the first time we've seen very accurate numbers because of the broad-based and very assertive testing that's going on. There is a recognition that there is a second round of infection. It's not to say it's reinfection, but there's definitely numbers moving again in China, broader than the Wuhan numbers. So the truth is we're only as good with the numbers as what the governments communicate to us. So we recognize that this is a public health crisis. We know that we're relying on governments through their testing agencies to communicate. We also know that we're probably not testing the most vulnerable people in our related communities because we're in outlying areas. And you can see, I've put there the Disaster Management Act, and I'll talk to the slide. Because this is a public health crisis, and because in this country we've called it a Category 1 notifiable disease, we were hoping to get fantastic information coming through. The decision by the president to send 10,000 healthcare workers out to do surveillance on a house-by-house basis to look at those who are symptomatic and test them, I think will give us possibly different numbers in a week's time to what we're seeing now. But it's important for us to recognize that the numbers will only be as accurate as being able to test people who incubated the virus for long enough for us to understand that there's enough viral load to test on. So on the screen now, you'll see our current position relating to surveillance. The Disaster Management Act, which is a 2002 act, and the regulations that have come in progressively in the last 2 weeks, have stated categorically that, and in some ways in a difficult way, that we all part of the human condition, which is the risk factor of spread of the virus. The hazard in this world is the virus. The risk is that we have too much social proximity and not enough hygiene and distancing to prevent that virus spreading into communities where there is a higher risk of infection. And those communities where we have a risk of severe illness are those where there's diabetes, hypertension, a history of TB, any immunocompromising disease, including persons who are HIV positive who might not be disciplined on their ARV regimes. So I've put here the acts that apply. The National Health Act and all the Health Professions Council regulations apply. And those of you that read the Business Day today will have appreciated that that telemedicine initiative that's been initiated has only been able to be initiated since the government allowed us as a country to practice telehealth in a way that we weren't permitted to do as a Friday. So that's good news for us. So we're seeing good response from our national government. We're seeing good response in terms of the National Management Act. For us, from an employment position, The Basic Conditions of Employment Act applies, and I know that right now on whether employers can give annual leave or not, and I'm not going to get too much into that. The Labor Relations Act, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, or the Mining Safety Act is important, and an act that we don't speak about often, which is the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, also needs to be considered, because we don't want to create a stigma environment where persons who test positive are persecuted. We've seen that happen in the past, and it's quite a sensitive place to be. So one of the things that we have to do is we need to create what are called adaptive safety nets. And the goal cannot be to stimulate demand in terms of purchasing demand and increase economic activity until we know that the virus is under control. The paradox is that we need to create these redistributive action. We need to make food available. We need to support persons and groups and small companies that don't have cash flow parachutes, that need daily cash. We need to support the poorest households. We need to manage waste, and waste includes sanitation and hygiene. So the picture on your right-hand side is yesterday's headline from the Business Day, and you can see the density of people there who are getting their social grants, who are withdrawing cash, and who are buying essential materials. Now, this is exactly the opposite of the social distancing that we need in order to prevent the spread from a proximity basis. So part of that headline says it's too early to gauge the effects of the national lockdown, but we'll see that as we progress. The challenge that we have, the challenge of social cohesion versus contagion. So globally, and I think we're doing it fairly well here, is ongoing government communication. Now that's happening in the form of ministerial feedback. We've had several conversations that the president has done. We also know that the challenge with that is it's not necessarily going into all of the ears of all of the people who need to hear. So this is a picture on your right-hand side on the preceding hours before the lockdown in India. You can see the immediate density of people getting onto buses. Now let's assume that a small percentage of these people are COVID positive. They're getting onto buses, and in epidemiology, we talk about the R0 number. Now, the R0 number is, or R0, is the number of people that each person can infect. In a very low infectious condition, the R0 is close to 1. I can infect one person. In a case like where we are with COVID, it's upwards of 3.5, which means that the exponential numbers that we're seeing are a reflection of exactly how infectious this virus is. So you can imagine seeing several hundred people getting onto buses and then moving out into rural and peri-urban areas where healthcare is not as robust. And that presents the significant social health shocks that we see. One of the things that we need to be aware of is we need to create social equilibrium. And what that means is that they use a face mask example that happened in Singapore and Korea, where they say, well, we'll give you face masks for each family, but we only want you to use them when you're sick. Because when you have your symptoms is when you're most contagious or infected. But the issue is now, how do we get people to use those masks, not sell those masks, manage those masks when they're ill, but also then go and get the care that they need? So the compliance with social distancing and quarantine and the disclosure is profoundly difficult. And that's what precipitates both the economic impacts and the impacts in terms of the spread of the disease. Three of the things that we're seeing, unfortunately, right now from an economic position with social cohesion is deglobalization. People are closing their borders, they're closing their trade, they're limiting the amount of movement, which is the opposite of the globalization initiative that we've been trying to do. There is already in our environment large degrees of xenophobia, and the risk of that escalating is profound. That plus the social unrest that goes with the lack of social support. And also, sadly, on the other side, we are starting to see price gouging and enrichment. We've seen some very powerful statements come out from the media on actions that have been taken against companies that have been doing this. So how do we support our population? Now, this is not only our population in South Africa or Southern Africa or Africa. We have a significant amount of persons who are living below what we would call the economic poverty line. So adapting to the context of the message that we're needing to give and testing and tailoring those messages. The question right now is, are we communicating the right things to the right people in the highest risk areas in the model and mode that they can hear and understand, in literacy independent ways, in culturally appropriate ways? So we can't eliminate the risk. And the risk in this environment, the hazard is the virus, the risk is the spread. So how can we manage the risk in a manner that limits the spread as profoundly as possible? How do we focus the resources on the most vulnerable people? Have we enough enlisted the support of community leaders, including religious leaders, including social leaders? Now, a lot of debate is on point 6 around human rights and saying, has this action of the lockdown created a human rights violation issue? And at what point do human rights need to be, whilst respected, to some extent limited so that the national good is met? So there was a constitutional court motion arguing that the lockdown was actually unconstitutional and in violation of citizens' human rights. It was dismissed by the Constitutional Court on Monday without a prospect of success, given the Disaster Management Act and given the state of crisis that we're currently in. Also then, the need to empower our youth is important, and staying abreast with the long-term challenges, which is the economic and econometric impacts that go with this. So I wanted to share with you now, as we change gears slightly and we go into the economic component of this. There's a couple of things that we need to be aware of. Is as much as things change, they just don't. So the World Economic Forum has issued a global risk report in January of each year for the last, let's call it the last 15 years, but it's possibly longer. In 2010, collectively, they regarded economic stress as our single biggest basket of stresses that we could face. And their 8 issues there were a weakening Chinese economy, a fiscal crisis, drops in the oil price, collapse of asset prices, retrenchment and unemployment growing both in developed and developing countries, global governance gaps, which was there, the risk of pandemic and the risk of infectious disease. Now, this was 10 years ago's report. If we go and we look at the national risk registers, at the moment, one of the things that you would notice is if you went onto the UK National Risk Register, you will see there's a lot of risks relating to flooding, to terrorism, to environmental risks of various degrees. But the single biggest risk in terms of relative likelihood and relative impact is pandemics. And that was already present on their National Risk Register in 2017. So it's not a new risk. But what is startling about that risk, for those of you that can't sleep like me, who wake up at 3 in the morning, there is a very sobering new index, which is called the Global Health Security Index. And this index was published last year on the 24th of October in 2019. It's a joint project by the Nuclear Threat Initiative and the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. And the research was done by the Economist Intelligence Unit. Basically what it said in the banner headline is that no country is prepared for an epidemic or pandemic. So it's not a case of us suspecting that we weren't ready. We simply haven't been ready. And there's a great note that's called press to test. Let's push something as hard as we can. Let's just nudge it. And if it works, then we were okay. And if it doesn't work, we'll address it. And what's happened in our economy between 2010, and I'm going to change the slide now to 2020's global report of the fiscal crisis. The press to test has been, can we reduce public spend in areas of infrastructure and in areas of healthcare and in areas of other support? Or can we reroute that? Or can we run leaner? And can we do just-in-time supply chain management? And as we've been pressing this, we've been pushing ourselves closer to what we're now seeing in the risks which came out in January this year of a fiscal crisis. So globally, economically, we've seen that the margin for fiscal stimulus is the narrowest it's been in our main economies over the last 20 years. Public debt has increased every year beyond incrementally since the 2008 and 2009 crisis. We're going to talk about that a little bit later because of the demand and supply chain contagions and the impacts of that. Tax rates have increased over the economies, and what that means is that there's less money available for parachutes, and higher debt and economic stagnation have helped explain why fiscal crises are potentially the biggest risks. Now, this is the risk. This is what we're forecasting may happen. When you've got an enabler like a global pandemic, in the case of this virus, it then allows us, sadly, in this case, to test the potential outcomes, because the risk is the effect of uncertainty on us achieving our objectives. If you're a risk manager or you're interested in risk management, you would then know that the International Standards Organization, the ISO standard, is ISO 31000. And the definition of risk there is the effect of uncertainty on us achieving our objectives. So in this case, what would happen if we went into a position where we couldn't manage our risk? So I'm introducing here the concept of risk-bearing capacity because not all of you may have been exposed to it. And basically, it's the maximum retention capacity that a group can hold when it thinks about its internal culture, how it's structured, what it does, what its views into the market are. And what it requires in order to address a risk-bearing capacity is you need to know what level of risk you can sustain on your balance sheet using no more than 10, maybe 15% of your available capital. After that, you're now beyond your risk appetite, and you're now moving into areas where you need to either borrow more money or have a risk transfer mechanism like insurance help you out of your debt. If you cannot get out of that, so your base debt or your base risk-bearing capacity is the debt that you can pay, or the monies that you can pay, or the obligations that you can meet using your balance sheet. So if you think about our current situation now, how many salaries, suppliers, creditors can you pay, including your rental, including how many months of operating costs off your balance sheet? That would be your base risk-bearing capacity. The next tranche to that is how much can you pay using a borrowing facility from the bank, or by monetizing certain of your assets or divesting certain of your structures. And off the back of that, and that might include selling of your equities if you were able to, or realizing your bond investments. Your next level above that in your risk-bearing capacity is your catastrophic level, at which you can no longer operate because you simply don't have the parachute or the monetization or the fiscal float in order to do that. So when we talk about risk-bearing capacity, we talk about it in terms of those things. So one of the things that you might be thinking of as we go through this journey is, does our business have enough capital to manage itself through the next 30, 60, 90, and 120 days? And have we put performance indicators in place now for what May, June, July might look like in the low road? So that's risk-bearing capacity. And we'll come back to that. Those of you that want to, there is a link there to a very good risk-bearing capacity research article on risk-bearing capacity and project management that Chen Chang published in 2015. So let's go back now and have a look at the global crisis, what they call the Great Trade Crash of 2008. And it relates to risk-bearing capacity and resilience, because really what we're looking at here is, at what point will parties pull out of a relationship with each other rather than carrying on? Now, that's important, because at what point do I stop buying, being a demand side issue, and at what point do I stop manufacture, which is the supply side issue. Now, those two together fall into what's often called the quasi-rent scenario. The quasi-rent scenario says, how long will I operate before I hit the point of minimum returns and I can no longer afford to operate my business or transact in the manner that I transact? And we saw that powerfully come up in the global crisis of 2008. The reason that it was so powerful at that stage is because this was a banking and lending crisis that very quickly became a demand side crisis globally, where the contagion effect of the fear of the liquidity led to people delaying purchases and delaying investments while they took a wait and see approach. And often we call that straight line in the future. We look at step 1 and step 2 and then step 3, and then we say, based on step 1, 2, and 3, we're going to move forward in the following way. And what that leads to, just like in the epidemic mapping that we saw earlier, leads to an overestimation in the first instance and an underestimation in the first instance on how severe it is, and an overestimation afterwards. And somewhere between that, we reach the normal space. So that's what happened on the demand side with the 2008-2009 liquidity issues. So two risks that were raised in terms of the WHO risks, and that's on the left side, and on the right side is the impact that the coronavirus has had on stocks since the outbreak. And you can see once the numbers started to significantly climb as of the 2nd of March, once it hit 100,000 and upwards, and if this graph that you can see here, you'll note that this fall of the graph, if you overlaid this fall against the climb of the graph that I showed you earlier with the numbers of people infected in the various regions, you can see there's an inverse correlation. As the numbers went up, the impact on stock and sentiment dropped accordingly. So high debt and liquidity exposure is part of the reason that we are now economically very vulnerable as a consequence of this. The global debt ratio, you can see the debt to GDP increased by 11% between 2009 and 2017, and another 3 to 4% between 2017 and now. In terms of the G20 economies, all of which have been profoundly impacted by the numbers of infected people and largely locked down, public debt is expected and did reach 90% of GDP in 2019. It's the highest level on record. Private debt has built up, largely because of lower interest rates, and China and the US have a significant amount of private debt. Now, private debt is only serviceable if there's the concomitant income that supports that through a viable supply chain. Your non-financial sector corporate debt, both in China and in the US, is a significant amount of GDP as measured in Q2 in China and in Q3 in the US last year. So what that does is it makes us economically profoundly vulnerable in terms of our resilience or ability to sustain a large period where trading is suspended. The macroeconomic drops that come out of a loss of aggregate demand have a very significant purchase and investment impact. So the second one, and I'm only doing two because we could probably limit today to about a 14-hour chat if we really wanted to get into it. But if we only look at these two, the second one is economic confrontation. There has been a stated very real risk of global economic stagnation. There's been downward pressure on the global economy. Realistically, the IMF growth forecast is of 3%, is down from last year's 3.6%. And it's the lowest, or it was the lowest, since 2008, which was 1.7%. Now, if we look at the actual numbers of growth through the first quarter of this cycle, January, February, March, I think we will be lucky to reach the lowest number of 1.7 of 2008. And what that does is it highlights the macroeconomic fragility that we've got. because of reduced trade and because of reduced foreign direct investment and all of the concomitant financial inequalities that come out of this, we're actually living what were regarded as the geopolitical risks. We're seeing them materialize. So one of the things that you'll notice on the right-hand side is in the Global Risk Report of 2020, that demand shocks are often shorter than the supply shocks, because as soon as people can, they go back into a mode of consumption and they repurchase. Now, that's fine in certain sectors, but in other sectors, and we'll talk about it in a little while, in other sectors, we don't see that bounce back happening as fast as we might want to. Equally, on the supply shock, on the manufacturing side, on the distribution side, the disrupted production and stagnation of the supply chain often lasts significantly longer. And post-2008, we know that that lasted more than 12 months after the demand shocks improved. So just to give some context to what I'm saying here, a really interesting book was published on the 3rd of March this year on the impact of COVID-19 on the economy. The impact moved so fast that a revision of that book was published on the 18th of March. And for those of you interested, I'll share those books with you. But what is the worst case scenario then was that there would be a 4% fall in the domestic demand in China in Q1 and a 2% in fall in Q2, and the rest of the APAC region would have a 2% domestic fall in Q2 and Q3. The realities were slightly different. The OECD model, and I'll show you on the next slide, underestimated the domestic demand fall in China by 60% and in the rest of the domestic EU and US markets by 75%. So taking you through and into that space, the likely slowdown in global GDP was predicted to be around 0.5 to 1.5%. In reality, given the last month's trade performance, Japan is down 10% or will be down 10%, US and Germany by 8.4%, with an average loss in the G20 by about 6.4%. So when we look at that against the global crisis and resultant what was called the Great Trade Crash, as I mentioned, the nations, like African nations with a high dependency on exports, are impacted the most, profoundly because there's no demand for their work, and consequently their manufacturing and services sectors tend to slide. I've mentioned that global trade was depressed by more than 12 months after 2009, and the initial economic recovery model, if our infection rates continue as they have over this last month, is going to be a 2022 to 2024 recovery horizon. So in short-term shocks like the global trade shock, the recovery shape was a V-shaped recovery. And a V-shaped recovery means it fell very fast and it climbed very fast. In this scenario where there's a persistency of this pandemic and the lockdowns are likely to extend into our midwinter season and into the European summer seasons, as we're starting to see, that sharp V rebound becomes a much wider base of a U-shaped recovery. And then in very sensitive supply industries like tourism, leisure, restaurants, there we're looking at an L-shaped recovery. And what that means is those don't generally recover the losses that they incur. You don't, because you didn't go to a restaurant for 3 months, then go 4 times in a week to recover what you hadn't done. You don't book 5 holidays to recover the holidays you never had. And so those industries, looking at the L-shaped recovery, are going to be profoundly hit, partly also because they are not essential services under our current definitions of service. And the consequence of that is there may need to be an economic parachute significantly tailored towards their needs. So I want to move and just talk about what this means in terms of the economics and what this means in terms of the global supply chains. So on the demand side, during the first 2 months of the year, Chinese production fell significantly. And while these were short-lived, they will recover, but how deeply and quickly they recover will depend on the depth of this. So you'll see the sharp red line in January, February going down towards 15%. And you will also recognize at the time that a lot of the freight on board that was moving and a lot of the air traffic impacts that were predicted have now come to be realized. So the hundreds of thousands of containers that are no longer filled with freight moving out of Chinese ports creates a backlog on the supply chain side. It creates a storage supply delay, and also the 6 to 8 weeks that these ships are at sea mean that there will be a delay on the once the demand side kicks up, the supply side delay will still have to catch up with it. So that creates the stagnation on the demand side. And an example of a supply side shock that happened as a relation to this is the oil price. So take Saudi Arabia versus OPEC versus Russia, and understand that based on the previous slide of Chinese demand and the activity that happened during that time, is there was a significantly reduced requirement for oil exports to China, which is one of Saudi's biggest markets. So that was an estimated 10% reduction in oil consumption. What the KSA did, what Saudi did, is they wanted a production freeze to maintain prices. Russia disagreed. We all know what happened as a consequence of that. Saudi increased to 12.3 million barrels a day, the maximum that they did, and they extended discounts to their key markets up to 20%. And we watched oil prices crash as a consequence of that, down to, at that stage of the 20th of March, $22.39, $22.4 per barrel. The forecast recovery for that on the futures, and you see that on the right-hand side, is 2022 to get us back to $40 a barrel. But we do know that there's volatility with that. Add to that Saudi Arabia's agri sector was decimated by a plague of locusts at roughly the same time, and that the impact of the oil price reduces the amount of their sovereign funds, not only there but in the GCC. The loss of oil price has a long-standing impact on the supply side and the sustainability of their economy. So these are very busy slides, but these are the slides that come out of the World Trade Organization. It's the global value chain networks. So I've got 3 of these just to illustrate slightly differently. On the left-hand side, you'll see the 2000, the year 2000, and you'll see on the year 2000 what the connectedness was between Germany and the USA, with China in the middle and Japan, in terms of both simple and complex trade networks. You can see how between 2000 and 2017, the significant impact that China had on centering itself through the trade networks, with Germany then feeding out into the European Union on the one side and the USA feeding on the other side. So this gives you a sense that what started in China in terms of this pandemic has both European and US and Chinese significant impact on all the trade networks, both on the demand and the supply side. So this gives you a sense on how, if you look at these networks, you also see how the virus spread in its very early days from China to its main trade partners in Japan and Korea, across into Germany, and probably from here get a sense on how Germany, Italy, and France and Great Britain so quickly got infected. So if we look at that, and I apologize for the next one being the textile sector looking a bit fuzzy. I said to a colleague of mine, it's almost like making my eyes bleed. But when you look at the trade network as it relates to textile sectors, you can see how dominantly and profoundly positioned China was with Turkey, with the US. The dark blue line shows the very deep dependent relationship on imports. And you can see on the other side of that, the trade network on the textile sector into Europe was dominantly through Italy, and then through from Italy into Germany. And again, you can see how, just like in the Spanish flu, where during 1917 and early 1918, you had the movement back along the supply chain from the trenches of this influenza, which became known as Spanish flu, back into the countries. And here you're seeing, if you look at the value chain, you can see and almost map and imagine the spread of the virus backwards into Italy and Germany and forwards into the US. So why is this important? Because as you look at your own risk management strategies and you look at the connectedness of your supply chain, my question would be, have you mapped your supply chain vigorously enough to understand the trade network sensitivities? And then finally, on this note, we look at information communication and technology sector, ICT. And again, you can see how interconnected it is. But this is probably one of the few chains that have been positively affected on one instance because of the virtual and web-based technologies. But China was a massive exporter of both optics and of storage devices and of mobile technologies. We won't know really what the effect of that looks like for the next probably 9 to 18 months. So again, if you're in the commodity sector, if you're in the textile sector, if you're in the services and leisure sector, or if you're in the textile sector, you get a sense on how this interconnectedness can profoundly impact your future business post-recovery. So this creates the perfect storm across Africa. The picture on the right-hand side is out of Kenya, Tanzania, and the locust swarms that came through in January and February. We have across Africa poorly funded healthcare infrastructure. We've got significant informal, small, medium-sized enterprise. We're very dependent predominantly on export of our products. We run labor-intensive mining, manufacture, transport, and service industries, including our tourism industry. And currently, when we look at the stimulus packages of $1 trillion potentially out of the US, 900 million euros out of the UK, 2 to 5% of the GDPs of Singapore and others, we say, what could we do across the African continent to free up that kind of liquidity to give us a stimulus package? We could remove border tariffs, we could move cross-border support, but the reality is we don't necessarily have the same kind of fiscal robustness that we're seeing in the more established developed countries. So the impact for us right now, as we come through, and I'm conscious that we pitched this for 60 minutes, so I'm going to move forward, and then those who want to stay on as we go through the risk side, you're welcome to do so. The economic impact for us is really dependent on how well we manage this this issue for us in terms of how we manage the fear. We also have to recognize that this disease, just like any other event, will disappear. And at that point, we'll be able to know how deeply flawed or deeply robust our country's systems are. We're seeing some of those challenges happen. You look at this long queue, and this is a picture that came out from earlier this week. And the comment that was made in Economics of Our Time on the 6th of March, which is subsequently needed to be revised. But the reality is we won't know how good our social infrastructure is and how stable not only our healthcare system is, but our supply of basic goods becomes. The question that was raised to me frequently over the last 2 weeks has been, what is a basic good and what is an essential service? And you go into the Labor Relations Act and you look at Section 71 and Sections 213, and they talk about essential service, but we don't have them necessarily listed in a manner and mechanism that addresses this issue. You can see on the ground of this picture, there's the red lines asking people to stand where they should stand. That's great if we can manage the sustainability. So here, which is the commentary out of yesterday's business day, is a representation of local contagion. You can see worst JSE quarter. We're down 22% in Q1 of this year. In the worst part of 2008, we dropped 13.6%. We dropped 12.83% in March. And at the time of writing this, which was yesterday, the rand had weakened by more than 11%. And I think today it's reached almost 18% in terms of its weakening as a result of the global effect and the local contagion that goes with that. So I wanted to just talk about notes on corporate governance, because when we talk about an integrated risk report, we're looking at it in terms of how King defines corporate governance being the network of rules and practices by which the directors ensure accountability, fairness, transparency. Now, what that means really is, and we take ethics, leadership, and corporate citizenship and stakeholder management as above the line, but the integrated management of strategy, performance reporting, and the functional areas that we provide that oversight on become important if you're a group that has a consolidated list of companies, some of which are essential services and some of which are not. So I was sharing with Raymond today. Raymond's a colleague of mine, and we were talking about the impacts of dashboards, both on a risk basis or a financial volatility basis. And I was saying, a dashboard is only as good as the numbers you put in. So I had an old car. I had a 1970 Mercedes, and you either had to rely on the speedometer or the rev counter to tell you how fast you were going, because if the speedometer didn't work, you were at 3,000 revs, you knew you were doing about 120 on the freeway. And if the odometer didn't work, you knew that if you had a full tank of petrol, you had about 280 kilometers, 300 kilometers before you hit reserve. But on a long distance drive where none of those four worked, you didn't know how fast you were going and you didn't know how far you could go. And that's the issue here with the integrated risk management, is if you don't have the right metrics coming in, you won't be able to gauge how far you can bear this risk. And the risk in this case is your liquidity risk, your solvency risk, your ability to sustain the U-shaped curve of the demand side slump, and gear up enough to manage the supply chain requirements as they come forward. So we know this is fairly standard stuff. Directors and executives need to maintain relevant knowledge. And in this case, that also includes knowledge on the global contagion, the risks, and the economic impacts that are likely to come forward, in addition to monitoring the affairs, in addition to taking critical evaluations that are needed. So some points that you already have in your pockets but are good to know. You need to know the Companies Act, specifically Section 76.2A2 on directors' responsibilities. You need to go back and revise Parts 4 and 5 of King. And if you haven't yet, you should have if you have, and if you haven't, you should establish a COVID-19 board committee that links through to risk governance, that looks at the clinical, non-clinical, and operational requirements and exposures that you have as it relates to business continuity, sustainability, solvency, liquidity, and ongoing operations in terms of your obligations to all your stakeholders, which includes not only your debtors and your creditors and your up and downstream supply partners, but also your employees, their families, and the communities in which you operate. Additionally, you've heard a lot on both the Mining Safety Act and the Occupational Health and Safety Act in terms of your responsibilities of providing a safe environment for your employees. So those are things that you need to be paying very careful attention to, because your ongoing communication right now is essential. So here and over the next two slides are a highlight of the definitions of the Disaster Management Act. I know you'll have all read it and you're aware of it by now, but in this case, this disaster talks about the progressive, widespread impact to humans caused by disease that could lead to death. And there's no question that there's a disruption of the life of the community. But I would suggest that you stay connected with the government, the government printers, and every day there are standard gazettes which are released that relate to certain aspects of the regulations of the Disaster Management Act on how we responded. Specifically in this case, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because you can read it, but I think the emergency preparedness that we have within our organizations and our ability to rapidly and effectively respond needs to be considered equally to what we're planning for our post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation. How are we, while we're looking at the near-term economic shocks of being able to afford salaries in the next 30 to 60 days, and whether we have enough OPEX and whether we have enough sustainability to continue, both including getting supplies upstream from our suppliers and providing downstream delivery. But how are we going to manage this when the world comes back on stream and we need to reactivate our covenants and delivery partnerships? One of the things which I think is very important for us to remember, which relates to the Section 26(2)(b), is that everything that's done has to be managed within existing legislation. It doesn't mean because we're in a disaster environment that employment law or common law or contract law falls by the wayside. There still has to be explicit relationships maintained with all of your stakeholders in order to meet both the economic challenges that you're going to face and the environmental circumstances that we're in. So at this point, you may want to, within your risk registers, be considering what efforts you have in place to create the normality of conditions once the let's call it return to work normalizes. We also have to look at saying, what are we going to do after the disaster is mitigated? How do we manage this? Are we going to be able to bring all of the essential skills that we had back to the table? Have we lost irreparably some of our market competitiveness? And if so, how are we going to put a plan in place to manage not only the existing business interruption, but the forward-going business activation? So my recommendations on that point is as you go forward, you need a communication plan right now for all stakeholders that relates, and this comes out of hazard and risk communication, is how are you updating your employees on college who may be affected? And affected includes infected or potentially infected, or having had worked with somebody who was tested positive, because the contact tracing now has to happen. And those employees need to be communicated with and supported. Then, how are you managing your remote work community? How are you managing communities and commuting, sick leave and annual leave? I don't think in the history of most of our organizations have we had to think about using paid and unpaid leave as a mechanism to support our cash flow. And that's pretty much where we're finding ourselves at the moment. The disclosure notices are important, and your notices to consumers are important. So if you haven't taken those steps, possibly your biggest exposure right now, the hazard is the supply chain contagion, and obviously that breaks down. The risk is that that contagion affects you at a reputational, environmental, financial, operational, and strategic level, and each of those should be recorded on your risk registers accordingly. So this is just a definition of what business continuity and risk registers should consider. I'm not going to spend real time on it. You can have a look at this and review it. I do want to then go into 3 short slides as we wrap this up. These slides are, they're common. You would have seen them before. But basically at this point, the question is, have you got the right risks identified and prioritized in order to get down into managing how these risks would happen? And I say that because without knowing which risks to prioritize, you won't know whether they fall into or out of your tolerance range. So I've put up here 6 steps that you could take back and speak. Some of you may be chief risk officers, some of you may be risk managers, some of you may have an interest in risk. The issues here are clinical, non-clinical, and corporate risks. Why do I put those 3? Because this is a pandemic, we have to consider the risk of contamination and infection in terms of your obligations under Section 8 of the Health and Safety Act. So you've got to consider, if people are sick, how long will they be sick for? Will they return to work? If people are sick, what's the contagion effect of them being sick, and how many co-workers could be affected, and how many operations would be affected as a result of that? Non-clinical, and I use non-clinical in the terms of COVID, is what is the mental health impact of people working remotely, of people being in fear, of people having loved ones potentially ill and dying. So there, not only do we have the immediate stress responses, but you need to consider what will post-traumatic stress look like, and will we be able to bring people back into the workplace and up to speed as quickly as possible? Because that will affect us in a multitude of different ways. The corporate risks then include, do we have the cash flow? Do we have relationships that are strong enough? What does the vertical and horizontal integrations of our relationships look like? So at this point in your first stage of screening your risks, the regulatory risks that you need to look at are those coming out from the regulations of the Disaster Management Act. Not only do you have to read those, but you have to look at them in terms of the existing requirements that you already have in place. So regulatory risk at this point is you are obligated to disclose if you know that somebody is COVID positive. You are obligated to contact trace all of the people who they work with. You are obligated to, if necessary, reduce or quarantine those people, or they will have to be quarantined, or if they're symptomatic, isolate. That will definitely have impacts on your operational aspects of your business and on your HR risks. The result of doing that and mapping it accordingly will give you your root causes. And here, those of you that do it will do root cause analysis of some form. You can use a failure mode effects analysis tool, but you'll need to do that off those 5 bands of risk at least in order for you to prioritize which risks are going to have investment, forex, cash flow and liquidity or balance sheet impact, and start by modeling those risks. Once you've modeled those risks, you'll then know which key areas to focus on, and those become your KRIs, your key risk indicators, and off that is how you'll be building your plans. And ultimately, in a case where you're a group where you've got a consolidation of subsidiary businesses, some which are considered essential services, some which are non-essential, some which are vulnerable to the demand side, and some which are vulnerable to the supply side, you may need to synthesize these risks both within your organization and across it to develop integrated maps. And off those integrated maps, you'll then be able to know what mitigations you need to take. So at this point, we've done a whirlwind trip through the economic impacts of this virus. And I'm opening this up to say, if any of you have any questions, you are welcome to type them through and I'll answer them as best I can. Thank you very much for listening up until now. So I will assume that there are no questions or comments. You're welcome to send them through on the email address that you registered on, and through the JSC we'll respond to them. We've recorded this and we will share it. If any of you want an audio copy, you're welcome to do so. And thank you very much for your time and attendance through the last 17 minutes. risk-bearing capacity calculations, the legal and regulatory commitments that we need to be taking mind of, and the development of detailed risk registers of COVID-related risks. Everyone, I'm going to sign off. Thank you very much for attending today.